So our custom is, when I read Torah, I set a timer.
My custom.
That's your custom. Just to be sure. So, if you weren't with us for Rosh Hashanah, I just want to remind you that at Congregation Beth Adam, we've, for many years, chosen to read different Torah portions. We stopped many years ago reading the binding of Isaac on Rosh Hashanah, the Torah portion that talks about obedience. Our congregation is less about obedience and more about questioning, self-reliance, questioning authority. And we've, over the years now, selected different Torah portions to read. Today, and last week, we are reading the early life of Moses. So let's go back a little. Rabbi Baum did a wonderful job, and if you weren't here, you can go and actually watch in our archives. Technology allows you to watch that Torah study. But most of us know the story. If we didn't learn it as adults, we certainly often heard about it as children. A lot of little songs were made up about Moses. So here was the story, right? There's this baby born at the time of, when the Egyptians wanted to kill all the Hebrew boys. So the boy was born. Parents hid him for 3 months in his home. The legend says that's actually not in the Torah. And they take the baby, Moses, put him in a basket, float him down the Nile. He's rescued by the daughter of the man who wants him killed, Pharaoh's daughter. Gives him an Egyptian name. What's really wonderful is his mother's right there to be his wet nurse for 4 to 6 years, depending on how you interpret it. He then goes out and somehow already knows his kinspeople, and he strikes down an Egyptian. We're going to read that. He gets scared that Pharaoh's going to kill him, so Moses runs away. He learns about God, and he comes back to rescue his people. And it's an amazing story. It is almost too good to be true. And you know, it isn't true. It's a story. And what's so interesting about it, and we need to understand it because it's so reflective of the people who wrote this book. They took classic images of what it means to be a hero and wove it together and created this fictitious person known as Moses. And probably they took bits and elements. These are some literary texts. So Rabbi Baum last week talked, there are 72 different stories that exist of children being born who need to be hidden, saved, and have what are often called the lost years. That's what Moses is. So they took that motif. Understand as well that we know this to be true because there is no extra biblical evidence. Moses isn't referred to in anything other than the Torah. In no other document we found him, and we find no other references to the Exodus. So what our ancestors did was they created this very interesting story. Everett Fox, who did a translation, talked about Moses as being composed largely of literary constructs. We don't even recognize them today, but they took bits and pieces and they glued them together. So Moses is born, and this is that Moses birth story is one of my favorites because it was the first midrash I ever learned. Some of you know we like telling Jewish legends. The first legend I learned, some people's first Jewish midrash, first Jewish legend, is Abraham breaking the idols. That's a legend that he broke. The first story I ever learned was about Moses. It says that Moses is heavy in tongue later in the story, and the rabbis wanted to explain it. And the first midrash I learned was when the baby Moses was brought to Pharaoh, there were his advisors who said, this child wants to usurp your throne. And they said, so we need to test to see whether or not the child is going to do that. So let's put before the child jewels and gold in one side and hot burning embers and coals on the other. And the baby's put before them, and the advisors say, we will be able to discern the child's intent by which pile he goes to. If he goes to the jewels, he's going to take your throne. If he goes to the ashes, well, he's not. I've never figured out the rest of that midrash. They never told us that piece of it, what it would say about Moses. So Moses is sitting before the jewels and the ash. He's putting out his hand, and he really goes for the jewels because they're much more attractive. They're much more glittering. They're much more exciting. And just as he's about to touch the jewels, an angel grabs his hand and thrusts it into the burning embers. And the baby's finger is burned, and there's an ember stuck to his finger, and he thrusts it in his mouth, and he burns his tongue. And that's why the rabbis say Moses is heavy of tongue. That was the first midrash that I ever learned. And as a child, I didn't know it wasn't in the Bible. It's not. But it's this rabbinic tradition of creating. And so all these years, I have loved the idea of midrash. So we're going to continue reading right now from where Laura read last week. And I want to read the last verse that she read in English before I begin reading the Hebrew that I'm going to start reading. The last verse she read was, when the child grew up, she, being the wet nurse, which is Moses' biological mother, brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. She named him Moses, explaining, I drew him out of the water. So the last verse we read was about Moses being maybe 4 or 6 years old. And then we're going to begin where I read. Vayhi b'yamim ha'hem. And what that means is sometime after that. It's a great line. If you ever have to write a term paper, sometime after that, you skip about 20 some odd years. And you just keep on going as if no one would notice. Yigdal Moshe, and he grew up. Yeah, after 17, 18 years, 20 some years he grew up. You need to understand the Torah is not literature in the way we think of literature. It's not a psychological novel. They had no interest in exploring what made Moses Moses. Because what made Moses Moses was less important than Moses becoming that figure who was then going to lead the Jews out of Egypt. It wasn't about the interior life of any of these characters. It was simply about moving this particular story forward. V'yatzeh el Ahav, v'yar b'sivlotam, v'yar ish mitri makeh ish ivri me'echav. And Moses then goes out, and he sees the laboring of his kinsfolk, and he witnesses their suffering, and he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. This verse has so many different things in it, it's going to be hard to get to all of them in the right. First of all, he goes out and he looks at the suffering of his kinsfolk. What's very interesting is, how did he know that they were his kinsfolk? The theory is, the rabbis, everyone has to play with this, that his mother raised him so she was 4 or 5 and she told him. But think about it, 4 and 5-year-olds really don't always have the best memories. And they may not always understand that, but they just make that presumption that he understands that he is Jewish, that the people outside the palace, the slaves, are his kinsfolk, and he goes out and witnesses their suffering. They're called Hebrews then. Rabbi Baum alluded to my rabbinic thesis saying it's a yawn. I would say it's a page-turner. And I have yet to figure out why it has not been made into a movie. It is about the word Jew. The word Jew doesn't appear in the Torah. The word Jew doesn't actually appear in the Bible at all. It is a later term. And as I recall, one of my professors, and since left the college, I believe, teaching somewhere else, didn't understand what the significance of my thesis was. He said, so what does it matter what people call one another? Labels are very important. How we perceive ourselves, there are lens, the context. Back when this was being written, they weren't Jews yet. Jews is a later, sophisticated concept that brings together religion and identity. Probably earliest use of that term was used, the word Jew or Judean was used by non-Jews to define us. Our internal term, as a people, have always been, most probably, Israel. Israel is the term that we've used as a people if you look at our literature. So it's an interesting text because it's early. It's still when we're using the word Hebrew in the text. So Moses goes out. He sees the suffering of his people. He recognizes them. And he sees that one of his people is being hurt. And he strikes down the taskmaster. And I have to find my place. Vayifen ko v'cho. And he looks this way and that way. V'yar ki ein ish v'yach et hamitri v'menehu b'chol. So he looks this way and that way, and he strikes the taskmaster. and he hides him in the sand. Did he kill him? It's unclear that Moses either intended to kill him or he was killed, but that's what we learn, that's what we understand it. That he wound up killing him either unintentionally or intentionally. There's no moral judgment in the Torah. There's no conversation, was this a good act or a bad act? It just simply existed. Now, of course, the rabbis then have to decide, is it a good act or a bad act? So there's a midrash about this, Jewish legends, where Moses is negotiating with God. Moses doesn't want to die. So he's trying to say to God, this is not a good thing. I don't want to die. And he says, look, and God says to Moses, who told you to kill that taskmaster? And Moses says to God, you killed all the Egyptian children. I killed one, you killed thousands. Well, how moral are you? That's an interesting notion in Judaism. That the ultimate authority of morality can be questioned by any of us. That's a Jewish tradition. Other synagogues would read today a story, or Rosh Hashanah, they would read a story about Abraham saying, God is correct, kill your son. In this story, Moses in the midrash argues with God, and later in the text, Moses argues with God again on Mount Sinai when God wants to kill all the Jews for being a stiff-necked people. They built the golden calf. God's angry. Moses says, wait a second, you schlepped us out of Egypt to kill us in the desert? What kind of God are you? And then God relents. And I think this is not insignificant. There is a whole rabbinic and Jewish tradition of us Jews, arguing with authority. It is not tangential to what it means to be Jewish. It is core to our essence that we question even those who claim to represent ultimate morality. It's interesting as well, this particular striking down of the Egyptian is one reason that Moses was not allowed into Canaan. There are two different traditions about this. One is he struck the rock twice too hard to get water to flow out. But there's a rabbinic tradition that he wasn't allowed in because he killed the taskmaster, which also speaks to the fact the reason there are two different reasons, it's a story. There is no real reason. The rabbis create these legends and explore it. Most people, when they read this, see Moses' act of striking down the taskmaster as a good thing. See it as a good thing. It's come into tradition. What's also interesting about this, what's Moses' first act as a Jew? This is it. This is how he declared that he was one of us. He saw a wrong and he wanted to right it. It's a very interesting notion. The authors of the text, in trying to say that Moses recognized his Jewish identity, goes out amongst his people. He didn't go to pray, didn't go to eat kosher food, didn't go and put on any religious garb. He saw something that was wrong and fixed it. It is a very profound notion of what it means to be Jewish, and we're going to see this theme a few more times before this is over. So Moses, we're back. Moses now has buried the Egyptian in the sand, v'yetzeh v'yom hasheni, and he goes out for another day, the next day. V'hine shnei anashim ivrim nitzim, and there are two Jews who are fighting with one another. V'yomer l'rasha lama takei ra'echa. And he looks to the one who seems to be the aggressor, and he says, so why are you hitting your brother? Vayomer, and the aggressor says, Mi samach samcha le'isar v'shofet aleinu har hageni ata omerka asher harata et hamitri. And he says, so the bad guy says to Moses, so who made you like chief and ruler over us? Are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? Which is really interesting, because now not only did Moses know he was Jewish, but everybody knew he was Jewish as well. Which sort of begs the question, how did that all happen? That becomes part of the story that moves it forward. Vayar Moshe, Vayomer echan noda hadavar. And Moses realizes that the deed is known, that the killing of the Egyptian is known. V'yismach paro et hadavar hazeh. And when Pharaoh finds this out, v'vakesh leharog et Moshe v'yavarech Moshe mipnei paro v'yeshev ba'aretz Midian v'yeshev al haba'er. So what Moses realizes when Pharaoh knows this, he got scared because he knew when Pharaoh realizes this, Pharaoh was going to seek him out and kill him. So he leaves, he goes to Midian, which is unclear where that place really is, and he goes sits by a well, which is a common motif. What's interesting about the story, how it ends, there are several aspects of it. Moses goes to Midian. What does he find in Midian? It's where he encounters the burning bush. He encounters Yahweh, God, for the first time. Where does he meet that God? In the backyard of his father-in-law, who is not Jewish, who is not a Hebrew. He is of another religious tradition. And it becomes very interesting. There's lots of theories about where the different God concepts in the Bible come from. And I say different God concepts in the Torah because there are multiple ones. And clearly one of these traditions is called the Kenite hypothesis, that Moses came to know that God that is described in this story through a different foreign tradition. He goes, sits by a well. Well, the well was the center of the community, if you will. You think of it, that's where people went and did their thing. They would sit there and they would meet. But what's also interesting is at the well, he also rescues some women. And rabbinic commentators have made the observation, Moses' first act as a Jew is when he sees an Egyptian hurting another and he strikes down the taskmaster and stops it. He then sees two Hebrews fighting, and he intervenes. And the third act is he sees, this is the non-Jewish world at this point, some women being mistreated, and he stands up for them. What I find fascinating is that the authors of the story and the rabbis come to see Moses as Jewish through his willingness to stand up to those who are being wronged. That's how we first come to know Moses. As somebody who seeks social justice. Somebody who sees that when there is a wrong, we need to right it. It seems a compelling story to me. It seems that is part of what it means to be Jewish. Too often we focus on rituals, we focus on words and prayers, but we don't focus enough on how do we change the world? How do we make it different? Are we willing to stand up when we see something is wrong and willing to right it? Are we willing to see something that is not perfect and working to correct it? Do we see somebody who is being oppressed, and do we recognize our responsibility to improve their life, to lighten someone else's burden, to feed someone who is hungry? Perhaps the lesson we need to take away from the story of Moses is not about prayer or belief, but about action. What do we need to do? What do we need to do in the world that we live to affirm who we are and to make the year to come a better year?